In part 3, we will describe the role and skills required of management accountants within the organization. The role of management accountants includes or involves the use of critical thinking, insight, and judgment. Management accountants are required to find ways of solving problems for management, taking the numbers that are being provided to management and interpreting that information so that managers can use that information, giving guidance as to what's critical or what's important for those managers to understand, and then responding to management if they ask specific questions about the numbers, or if they would like to see things in different ways. Then the management accountant has to figure out how they can make that happen. The management accountant is a valued financial advisor. So managers are going to be looking towards the management accountant to provide guidance in terms of the use of assets, in terms of the turnover of assets, whether to buy a new piece of equipment, whether to use an existing piece of equipment, whether it's a good idea to invest in a company outside the organization, how much should we be paying for assets, what is the cost of capital. All of those financial issues will come into play, and that's what makes the management accountant a very valued financial advisor. And then finally, just as we've been saying over and over, financial managers help and assist with making critical business decisions. Some of the skills that are required are listed there. I'm not going to go one by one. You can actually read those. Now, when we're trying to determine whether or not managerial accounting is important, or I think we could all conclude pretty easy that management accountants are important, but how they can be important, or to what individuals can they be a big part of solving problems. Entrepreneurs are going to turn towards management accountants to help them understand information. In many cases, entrepreneurs are very good at doing something, and then they turn around and open up their own business, but it takes a while to understand how to run a business. And so management accountants can help provide information, they can provide guidance, they provide financial information so that entrepreneurs can even make better decisions. Business management, obviously we've been talking over and over how management can use managerial accountants. Marketing and sales, that's kind of a surprise, and we'll see as we go through this entire course. In many cases, we think management accountant is all about controlling costs, measuring costs, making sure we're running as efficient as possible. But in many cases, management accountants are providing good information to marketing and sales individuals so that they learn and understand what is their best strategy in order to make the most money for the organization. Which products are giving us the best profit margin? That's something that management accountants can help with. So that's also an indication of how management accountants can be very important, even to marketing and sales. And then non-business majors, well, many times your entrepreneurs are really not even business majors. Many times entrepreneurs are really just trying to start a business or do something that they know very well. They're trying to go ahead and make that work on their own. And so management accountants can help guide them with all the business elements and providing some guidance in that respect as well. The next slide shows the typical organizational structure and where you might find accountants, controllers. When we were talking about accountants in the financial accounting world, in Accounting 1, we're talking about accountants that work for CPA firms. That is financial accountant, an accountant that works for a CPA firm who works on audits, who works on financial statements for clients, who works on reviewed financial statements. All that is specifically related to financial accounting. But when we're talking about management accountant, we're talking about those individuals that actually are accountants, but they work within the organization. So at the highest level specifically related to accounting, and that you will find a chief financial officer, a CFO, many times their background is management accountant. They come up the ranks either from a treasurer, a controller. And so we look to the chief financial officer as the one that's really the overseer of management accountants. We also have the internal audit department that also can answer to the CFO. They're going to be in line with financial accounting to make sure that the numbers are reasonably accurate. And internal audit organization will also, or group will respond to the audit committee, which gives a kind of a pathway in case the CEO and the CFO are not as ethical as one would like. The internal audit reports also to the audit committee, which is a direct line to the board of directors. So that gives some level of independence to the internal audit. Objective number 4, we're going to describe the role of the Institute of Management Accountants, the IMA. All right, so the Institute of Management Accountants is a national organization made up of management accountants. And it is a professional association for management accountants in the United States. The mission, as listed on the slideshow, is to provide a forum for research, practice development, education, knowledge sharing, and advocacy of the critical, ethical, and best practices in management accounting and finance. And they even have their own certification. Up until now, you might not have even heard of it. Most of us if we've had any kind of an exposure to any kind of a certification, well, Certified Public Accountant, a CPA. But we have to remember the CPA is catered towards financial accounting, external to the organization. The Institute of Management Accountants has a certification that really is catered towards providing certifications to management accountants. And we call this a CMA, a Certified Management Accountant. Now, the CMA requirements are just as rigorous as the requirements for the CPA. It's just different. The CMA requires a 2-part exam, part 1 and part 2. There's 2 years of work experience that's required. There's also continuing professional education. There's a bachelor degree that is required, and then the CMA earns 61% higher salaries than non-CMA peers, okay? So if you find as you're going through this program, let's say you've made a commitment towards becoming an accountant, and you're trying to determine whether or not, what you're learning is now there are 2 pathways. There's the financial accounting pathway, which is the Certified Public Accountant working for CPA firms. And then there's the CMA, the Certified Management Accountant. This is another pathway towards individuals who want to work for organizations, who want to be the CFO, who want to be controllers. And so now we have another pathway for you to follow if you find that you have a better interest in becoming part of an organization. I will be honest with you, in my career, my whole objective was to become a CMA, or at least a CFO, in which case I did. If you read my background, I did become a CFO. And at that time, when I was finishing up my education and moving on, it was really my objective to work in the private sector and or for government sector, and not really focus on financial accounting, but more towards management accounting. And it wasn't only later in life, I was about my mid-30s and decided, I really do want to become a CPA. And when I just made that decision, I had to take a pretty good cut in pay. I was already a CFO controller for a local agricultural company. I had to make that decision to take a pretty big cut in pay and begin working for a public accounting firm, because to become a CPA, you have to work for a CPA firm. And so I ended up becoming a CPA, and that was my pathway. But I will tell you that the CMA is a very legitimate option. And really, if you plan on working for an organization for the rest of your life, this may be a very good option for you to look or consider the CMA as opposed to becoming a CPA. The CMA is a certified management accountant. The certification is offered by the IMA, the Institute of Management Accountants. And they also provide a framework for ethical practice. So what we have here is a statement of ethical professional practice. You can read through it. But in essence, we're talking about competence. You have to be competent in what you do. You have to understand confidentiality and how that's important within organizations, integrity, and credibility. Those things that we learn that are just basic understandings of what ethics are all about are applied specifically to management accountants. In many cases, when you work in the private sector and in the public, or as for a public accounting firm, you're going to come across what we refer to as ethical dilemmas, which means we've come across a situation where the right decision isn't really obvious. Whenever you take an ethics course, it almost seems pretty obvious when individuals are acting unethical, but there's going to be many instances in your life where you're going to come across decisions, and it's not as clear cut as to what the right decision is. When you're coming across these kinds of ethical dilemmas, there's an outline here for you. The first thing you're going to want to do, the first bullet point says, follow the company's established policies. Whatever the policies that are in place, that's a good chance that the development of those policies was consistent with good ethical practices. But even after that, if it's unresolved, you're going to have, once some strategies, discuss this with the immediate supervisor or next higher up. If discussing the CEO, notify the audit committee or board of directors. So, let's say you're a CFO and you're noticing that the CEO is not acting ethically, then you may want to go off to the side and speak to the audit committee about what you're seeing. You can also look at discussing this with an objective advisor. And in many cases, you build up relationships with friends and colleagues where you can trust them. You know that they'll provide you at least their opinion. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to agree with it, but at least you can get some insight of what their thoughts are. And then also, you want to be looking at maybe in very serious cases where there may be some legal matters, you might want to consult an attorney. Now, let's understand ethics relative to the law, okay? What we need to understand is not all unethical behavior is illegal, but all illegal behavior is unethical. I think the first one is a no-brainer. The example that I could give you is an individual who has an affair on their spouse. That is, in most states, is not illegal. But most people would suggest that that is unethical. So the line of ethics in terms of the higher standard would be ethics. You've got to live up to a higher standard when we're talking about ethics. Sometimes unethical behavior isn't necessarily illegal. And I'm going to change this a little bit. In most cases, illegal behavior is unethical. And I say most because I think we could all find someone can go find some ridiculous law somewhere that's been written either a ton of years ago, or it's really not relevant today, or maybe it just wasn't really thought through, that most people would consider to be an ethical practice. The IMA's ethical principles include honesty, fairness, objectivity, and responsibility, much broader than what is considered illegal. We'll go on to discuss the business trends and regulations affecting management accounting. Now, the textbook discusses this. There's a much more emphasis on data analytics, critical thinking. And what we're seeing is that there is so much information out there. The question becomes, can we analyze all that information? Can we use it? Sometimes, in some cases, we get information overload where there's just so much data, so much information that we have trouble processing it. So we need to find ways of managing this data, managing this information systems in a more cost-effective manner, in a way that better targets sales and markets, in a way that can uncover fraud and also help with innovation. Now, understanding that technology is making it so that some software that used to be very expensive and out of reach for many companies is now relatively inexpensive. The example here is QuickBooks. It is a pretty inexpensive piece of software and is used by many small organizations. Even small to medium-sized organizations can benefit from QuickBooks. And it's kind of a generic piece of software that helps with the accounting system, but there are some management tools within the system. So in many cases, management accountants are asked to use that software to help with the development of reports. I know I use QuickBooks for my practice, for my business, and I've looked at the reports and the various reports, and it's really helpful for me to manage certain elements in my practice. Larger organizations, however, use what are referred to as enterprise resource planning systems. And what we're talking about is software that integrates all elements of the company. So we're talking about production, we're talking about engineering, we're talking about sales and marketing, talking about accounting, all right? So all those plus warehousing, plus inventory control, all those areas are put together in one large system. Usually it's proprietary in nature. Well, when I say proprietary, it may be even industry specific. Larger organizations, there are people out there, there's software developers that go in and figure out exactly what an industry needs and develops accounting, production, inventory control, MRP, ERP systems that really address in all the issues associated with a large enterprise, and then makes it so that it's all integrated, so that the accounting systems integrate with sales and marketing, production integrates with sales and marketing and accounting, human resources is integrated with accounting. I mean, all of the pieces are put together. So when we're talking an enterprise resource planning systems, we're talking about large information systems that integrate most, if not all, of the enterprise systems. Now, as these systems are gathering information and gathering data, really the systems gather data, which then is processed to a point where it can provide some information. But the information puts us in a point where we're actually doing some critical thinking. We're taking data, transposing it, and adding it and dividing it and summarizing it and categorizing it. And then that's bringing us information. And then we use that information to make better decisions, right? There's also a bit of a shift, at least until recently there was. I don't know if that's going to continue now with a lot of things going on with this world today, but there seems to be more of a knowledge economy. In other words, what's of value today, of much more value today than there has been in the past, is knowledge. And people are willing to pay a lot of money for knowledge. And that's why it's become such a valuable commodity. The textbook goes on to talk about how barriers to international trade have fallen, which was the case up until about 2 to 3 years ago. Who knows where things are going to go from now into the future. But I suspect that the economic pressures will make it so that at some point in time, we will have much more globalization and much more emphasis on globalization like we had up until about 2 or 3 years ago. And so the globalization implications for management accounting means that we need more accurate and timely information. We need to decide whether to expand into foreign countries or not. And there are new management techniques from international competitors. So we constantly have to be looking at how we manage our companies, because we're not just competing with companies that are locally, that are around here. We're competing with companies across the nation, across the continent, across the world, depending on how large we are and what we're doing. There's also a big focus now, particularly in certain areas of the world, in the United States for sure, but also in the context of Southeast Asia. There's a big emphasis on lean thinking, and that is, how do we find ways of lowering waste, which when you lower waste, that will reduce costs, okay? And the less wasted time, the faster we're going to get a response to our customers. And for some of you who are actually very interested in production, you'll see that there is what we call a Six Sigma, and it's a bit of, I believe it's a certification, I think it's a certification that is issued to companies who meet certain levels of perfection. Very high level of perfection is expected when we're looking at organizations who have achieved or have earned a Six Sigma certification. And then now, as it relates to today's world, we often use the words sustainability, which from a business perspective means, well, how do I sustain the business? How does it continue to exist over time? Sustainability is obviously a very important concept in business, but in today's world, we're expanding that concept to include sustainability as it relates to the society, the environment, and how these things are affecting other things. So when we talk about sustainability, we're not just talking about profitability for a company. A company obviously has to be profitable in order to continue to exist. But the question becomes, are we becoming profitable at the expense of the environment? And if so, then it may be all for nothing, because if we're destroying the environment, then we're ultimately going to destroy our ability to continue to exist as people. So the emphasis is, how do we try to find a way to sustain ourselves, not only from a business perspective, but from a global perspective? Looking at the last bullet point, it's triple bottom line. Recognize a company's performance should be viewed in terms of profit, people, and the planet. The textbook goes on to talk about Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Sarbanes-Oxley was an act that was passed by Congress in direct response to some of the misleading information that was being presented by very large organizations, very large publicly traded organizations, including Enron, World Com, Tyco. There were a number of companies that it just so happened at the same time, many of the issues were discovered at one point in time. And so it became such a big deal that Congress decided that there needed to be something done, and they passed a Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And what it did, or what its purpose was, to restore trust in publicly traded corporations. If we don't have trust within investors to be able to put their money into companies knowing that the information that they're receiving is accurate, then people won't invest. If people don't invest, money stops circulating, companies don't expand, and all of a sudden there's no jobs, and we have economic collapse. So it's very important for companies to maintain that trust. In this case, in early 2000s, there was a little bit of a shaker in the context that people were starting to lose confidence in the information that was being presented. And so what Sarbanes-Oxley did is enhanced internal controls, or they had provisions that were to enhance internal controls, enhanced financial reporting requirements, and also put in play regulations and penalties. So a bit of a movement by the government to restore confidence to the investors so that the economy was not so negatively impacted by companies who decide to do the wrong thing. There's some specific elements outlined in SOX. You can take a look at that, and that concludes chapter 1. We'll be doing this all semester long, so hopefully it is helpful for you in your studies.